Today I'm taking a brief look at the trajectory of the Final Fantasy series, and the increasing speculation around multimedia remakes, adaptations, and additions to some of Square's flagship titles. Since the release of the Final Fantasy VII Remake Part 1, back in 2020, there's been a lot of discussion around the direction that this game is taking, how it amalgamates earlier compilation material, but chiefly how it is in fact a sequel of uncertain narrative portent rather than a straight-up remake. And looking more broadly at the multi-installment Final Fantasies, they've all hinged around what comes next, rather than what came before. They indulge the consistency of a central character, whether it's Cloud Strife, Yuna, Lightning, or whoever, to thread the titles together with the original game, and also in an effort to prolong and reconcile a personal character arc within a new set of circumstances. But in light of these renewed speculations around Final Fantasy adaptations, which have previously resided only in fan forums but seem to have an increasing substance, it's interesting to look at the landscape of Final Fantasy, its increasing serialization and modernization, and consider the scope for expanded universes, which Final Fantasy VII and its compilation material has already laid the foundations for, and may well be a direction that Square is heading in for several of its marquee installments. But looking first at what already exists and jumping back to the conversation around Final Fantasy sequels, I think the reason that game sequels feel quite strange for some fans, particularly looking at Final Fantasy and the sprawling epic stories that they are, where you have a huge arc that concludes with saving the world from a big bad guy, but also the heroes having some kind of personal salvation and personal closure, having defeated their nemesis and saved the world. And the issue around this, with sequelizing this, is that more often than not, the end of the original game is a natural conclusion to their quest. And there's not often much room to maneuver thereafter without creating a wholly new set of circumstances and obstacles. And the issue here is that creating new obstacles and new circumstances can often feel quite derivative or contrived or inauthentic. Taking Final Fantasy X-2 as an example, looking at this game, its strength as a sequel, and indeed its necessity for existing at all, is that it's interesting to see the world of Spira following the fall of Yevon and Sin no longer being a factor, and of course attempting to reconcile with the Tidus, which was left very much on a cliffhanger, but actually without the complexities of Yevon and Yevon, and of course the gargantuan threat that is Sin, which was the central obstacle and the thematic centerpiece of the original title. Some found it very difficult to continue this game and this story with the same momentum now that all these existential threats have been dealt with. In similar fashion, Final Fantasy VII Advent Children suffers from the same issues, wherein the fallout of the live stream and the Geostigma story, it made sense and it was quite interesting to see those repercussions of Cloud and Co saving the planet. But having Cloud Strife as a central hero without Sephiroth, who is his perpetual foil, is extremely difficult to do, because Sephiroth is the definitive obstacle to Cloud. He's integral to Cloud's personal dilemma, which had been brilliantly crafted and layered and built up over the course of the original title. And so Square had no recourse other than to resurrect Sephiroth, albeit briefly, in Advent Children. And yet again, for the Final Fantasy VII Remake, Sephiroth is back again in this sort of pseudo-sequel format, which the critics of this move argue, not without reason, that perhaps this undermines and artificially drags out the entire arc, the climactic battle and the conclusion of the 1997 game. And the more that they pursue new Final Fantasy VII content, the harder it is for Square not to just have Cloud and Sephiroth chasing each other around for eternity, because these two are at the centre of the Final Fantasy VII story. And so, looked at this way, the new multiverse direction that the remake is going in, it makes perfect sense from, I suppose, a business perspective, because having made a prequel in Crisis Core and having made a sequel in Advent Children, Square needed new ways to continue telling this story and propelling the Cloud and Sephiroth saga forwards. And the only real route for them was to create an alternative timeline. But moving on and getting to the heart of the discussion here, I find it interesting that Square have thus far, with only a couple of notable exceptions, primarily been concerned with sequels when it comes to the continuity of their central numerical Final Fantasy games. Because aside from having an established and potentially popular central character, such as Cloud Strife, Yuna, Lightning, whoever, to build around, I think there's equally scope and potentially more benefit and coherence for a particular installment's grander narrative and the grand meta for them to start building out prequels. And indeed, I'd go further to suggest that actually one of the prevailing strengths of Final Fantasy's writing teams, regardless of your opinion of a given numerical game, is their world-building ability and their competence in crafting settings with a great sense of history and lineage and a sense of contemporary events that we find ourselves in being directly correlative to and the result of something or someone that came before. And more often than not, throughout the game, there are references to and reprieves that call back to said events, whether it's Zack Fair and the events at Nibelheim in Final Fantasy VII, Laguna's adventures following his flight from the Galbadian military in Final Fantasy VIII, or Zidane Tribal's transition from a wayward agent of Garland to an affable Tantalus vagabond in Baku's crew in Final Fantasy IX. So more often than not, there's plenty of context and a solid foundation to work from in the majority of Final Fantasy games, some of which has been expounded upon, such as Episode Ardyn in Final Fantasy XV and Zack's story in the aforementioned Crisis Core, which shows, I suppose, that the approach to prequels can indeed pay off. So, turning to pros and cons then, I think contrary to the aforementioned issues that some have around sequels, with them feeling artificially prolonged or rather listless in their purpose, prequels on the other hand have the advantage of quite an interesting narrative trajectory, because for many players, and perhaps even most players, the ending is already known. It's a predefined destination, such as Zack Fair's demise at the end of Crisis Core being a classic example. And so the journey is the destination, and the opportunity here is to augment the worlds and characters that had previously only been alluded to or fleetingly seen, which, as I say, would contribute to and build up this wider meta-narrative of a given numerical title. In this sense, prequels have a reassurance about them that sequels don't, because rather than a potential feeling of where the hell is this story going and is it living up to expectations without, for example, original party members in Final Fantasy X or the original bad guys and so on, players are much more intrigued about how existent characters and known characters may have arrived at a moment in time or an event that is alluded to or established in the original title. And a classic example of that may well be Jecht in Final Fantasy X, because from the Legacy game, we know that he's traversed from Zanarkand to Spira in much the same way that Tidus did. He became Yuna's father's guardian, and he eventually became Sin. And all of this is established from periodic flashbacks and conversations in Final Fantasy X proper. However, the actual journey and the intrigue and the nuance of his character development is thus far left very much to the imagination. And as we know, as we understand, he goes from a very gruff, egotistical man with a drinking problem to someone of considerable compassion and self-sacrifice. And I would argue that this is ripe for exploration in potential prequel media. So I think prequels, in dealing with established canonical elements and legacy characters, whether they are prominently featured in the original game or not, is quite a solid foundation on which to build a new story and contribute to a wider Final Fantasy saga. But turning now to the downsides, there are a few things to consider that potentially also attributable to sequels to some degree. And the first is that a lot of Final Fantasy games, and particularly the ones that are often regarded as, the best ones, were released quite a long time ago, indeed, in some cases, decades ago. And so refreshing audiences on characters and context and places in a time that is now so removed from the initial release is arguably quite a stretch, and making a business case for a prequel for a 20-plus-year-old game, it may raise some eyebrows at an executive level. And this also applies to sequels, arguably to a lesser extent. But I think the reason Final Fantasy VII as a remake largely gets away with this is that it is a title that is buoyed up by its legacy and its reputation in such a way that it's almost impervious to time. But regarding sequels or prequels, for equally best-selling but perhaps lesser universally renowned Final Fantasy games, which beyond Final Fantasy VII and beyond gaming circles and RPG circles is most of them, I think it's fair to say. The marketability of a prequel or a sequel around Final Fantasy VI, Final Fantasy VIII, so on, is perhaps a bit more questionable, because although we love them and we're RPG fans, looking more broadly at the arena of gaming and beyond, I think it's fair to say that perhaps considerably less people have perhaps heard of them. A second potential negative, from either a business perspective or from a fan perspective, beyond this kind of passage of time, is that in many cases you will no longer be in control of your legacy characters. And I think the reason that sequels have been more popular, perhaps with Square, is that, you know, you do get to take control, for the most part, of characters you would have played as in the original game. So once again, looking at Crisis Core, Episode Ardyn, and even little curios like Final Fantasy XV, A King's Tale, which is actually quite a fun brawler game. Past events don't really feature our known heroes from the numerical game, because they either haven't assumed the status of hero yet, because, you know, that's what their main game is about, it's the entire arc of their journey, their hero's journey. Or perhaps in many cases, such as Noctis in the aforementioned 15 spin-off, they may not have even been born yet. So the reliance here is on the prequel characters being at least as interesting, at least as potentially known, and at least as capable of character development and carrying a game than the original protagonists of the mainline game, which, as we saw with Zack Fair's character arc, is perfectly possible. And although he had only the most fleeting of appearances in the original Final Fantasy VII, and resided as a bit of historical context and as a catalyst to Cloud's personal muddling character arc, it shows that if written well and approached appropriately, these background characters are more than capable of stepping up and helming a game on their own merits, in a lot of cases, I think. So, moving on, and just before concluding here, it's also interesting to look at the landscape of Final Fantasy, the games that we've seen published over the years, and consider which may be most warranting or realistically primed for a prequel, based on what's offered in the original game. And naturally there's going to be some subjectivity here, based on what Final Fantasies people prefer. But for me, even trying to look at this objectively, I feel that the stories that are readily structured for a prequel installment over any other perhaps is Final Fantasy X and Final Fantasy VIII. And on the one hand, with Final Fantasy X, we have the Jecht story that I've mentioned already, the clear personal growth that he has on his adventure, which is glimpsed via flashbacks but never outrightly seen. But beyond Jecht, we also have Auron, who we witness in flashbacks as quite a brash, temperamental warrior monk who obviously undergoes his own transition to become a more wizened and reserved character. And Lord Braska, who is at the very heart of this trio and is the centrepiece of this original summoner's journey. Around these characters, we also have wider machinations and interesting events that would have occurred and echoed into later story, which is Yuna's adventure, such as Lord Jiskel and his attempts to reconcile Guado and human relations, the Ronso and the Guado joining Yevon in general, the conflicts with the Albed, and of course the descent of characters like Kinnock and Micah, who became quite apathetic and villainous characters by the time the original game takes place. So I think there's a strong case for this title, and you know, we even have the party members ready-made, because we have Braska, Auron and Jecht established as a party, which I think would be great to sort of pursue in the future. Turning to Final Fantasy VIII, we have very much the same thing, with Laguna, Kiros and Ward being a ready-made party, and indeed familiar to the player, because, you know, they were briefly playable during the original Final Fantasy VIII as well. But the true potential of a prequel here comes from what we glimpsed in Laguna's dream sequences, and these offered us a patchwork of memories of random, sporadic moments and places which occurred in his lifetime, but they never came together as a cohesive whole, and so it's very much left to the imagination of what Laguna's journey kind of really looked like. So the opportunity here is to thread Laguna's journey in with the wider meta, the wider story, and address questions such as how did he meet Kiros and Ward, how did his relationship with Rain evolve, and what were the events that led him to defeat Sorceress Adel and ascend to the presidency of Esthar. I think there's plenty of potential in here, and again, along with wider events in Final Fantasy VIII, such as President Deling manoeuvring politically, Sid Kramer establishing Garden, and so on and so forth. I think there's a lot of potential here that could potentially be used, and there's something quite poetic about a conclusion of a game that would see Laguna sitting as president on one side of the world, while his child resides as an orphan, completely unknown to him, on the other side of the world. So I like that, and I feel that there's a lot of substance to this that would see it kind of succeed as both a tie-in and potentially a standalone entry to the Final Fantasy series. So, wrapping up here, this has obviously been a speculative look at where this series could go, now that Square seem quite committed to expounding upon and extending several of their legacy titles, and where prequels can and potentially should play a part and slot into that.